The elevator of the building on Central Street had always functioned flawlessly. The camera reliably recorded the residents coming and going, and nobody paid attention to this until the evening of the 3rd of February. On that evening, exactly at 22:47, the camera captures how Naomi Coleman and her 4-year-old daughter Ava enter. Ava stamps energetically with her feet on the tiles and tells her mother something vivaciously, who apparently does not pay too much attention to her. The doors close. This is the last recording showing Ava independently entering the elevator. Exactly 32 minutes later, at 23:19, the elevator doors open again. In the recording, Naomi Coleman can be seen, now alone, pressing a small figure against herself that hangs lifelessly in her arms. The child looks as if it were sleeping. Naomi's face shows no panic, but her breathing is noticeably accelerated. The camera captures each of her movements as she steps out of the elevator and quickly goes to the underground garage. A few minutes later, Naomi is already knocking on the neighbors' doors and asking them to call an ambulance. What happened in those 32 minutes? The answer to this question becomes the main focus of the investigation. The rescue team arrives first. They do not ask many questions. The situation seems immediately clear to them. Naomi speaks of an accident. She repeats the sentence, "slipped in the bathtub," but the words sound uncertain, not convincing. The paramedics quickly notice the contradictions in her version. Ava's hair is completely dry and there is not a single drop of water on her clothing. They do not voice their doubts aloud, but transmit their suspicions to the subsequently arriving police officers. The examination of the apartment takes place already 15 minutes after the emergency call. The police officers thoroughly check the premises. The first oddity immediately catches the eye. The floor in the bathroom is completely dry. The towels are neatly folded, and nothing indicates that any accident occurred here recently. But one object draws the investigators' particular attention: a large plush bear, carelessly thrown into the storage room next to the bathroom. 2 hard plastic eyes clearly stand out on its head, too rigid, too heavy to be used in a toy intended for such a young age. One of the investigators examines the bear attentively, then sets it aside and notes its importance for further investigations. But the real concern arises later, already in the ambulance, when the forensic examiner examines Ava. He looks attentively at her face and neck and notices tiny punctiform hemorrhages on the eyelids. These barely visible red dots become important evidence that the mother's version of the fall cannot be true. They speak of only one thing: mechanical impact on the respiratory tract. The police immediately concentrate on Ava's immediate environment. Naomi Coleman, the mother who was nearby and first reported what had happened. Her behavior seems strange, emotions restrained, answers short, sometimes even indifferent. But this is not yet proof, and the police officers know that first impressions are often deceptive. The second person who comes into the sights of law enforcement is Brandon Nguyen, Naomi's boyfriend. He had already been living with them for several months, but precisely on this evening, he was for some reason outside the field of view of cameras and witnesses. His absence raises questions. Where was he during those 32 minutes? And what is this man hiding, who at 22:58 sent a strange message to Naomi's phone? "I am outside. Answer me." The SMS remains unanswered. It is precisely Brandon's message that becomes the first false trail that the investigations initially follow. This short SMS looks suspicious. The police allow for the possibility that Ava could have become a victim of a domestic conflict that could have been provoked by jealousy or aggression on Brandon's part. However, it soon turns out that his phone was located far from the house at the time the message was sent, registered at a radio tower 7 kilometers from the apartment. The version of his physical presence in the house becomes weak, but does not completely disappear from the police's field of view. When the expert completes the preliminary examination of Ava, he calls the lead investigator. He speaks calmly, quietly, but every word sounds clear and certain. The punctiform hemorrhages on the eyelids do not match any of the scenarios stated by Naomi Coleman. The paramedics had been right with their first suspicions. The situation does not look like an accident. Ava's survival time after the impact was only a few minutes. The expert falls silent without finishing the thought, as if wanting to emphasize the seriousness of what had just been said. At this time, the investigators are already sealing the apartment and taking the laptop and the bear with them to examine them thoroughly later. These objects become the most important pieces of evidence, but nobody can yet say exactly how they relate to what happened. The next step is obvious. Find Brandon and interrogate him. So far, he is not yet the main suspect, but his behavior looks too suspicious to ignore. Almost no time remains for the search. The night is passing, and every hour of delay could cost too much. The key question for the investigations remains Brandon Nguyyen's whereabouts during those 32 minutes that became the central puzzle of this story. His message, "I am outside, answer me," sent to Naomi Coleman at 22:58, initially looked suspicious and attracted the investigators' attention. But was it really so simple to confirm or refute his alibi? In the early morning, as the sky over Edmonton was just beginning to dawn, Detective Michael Harris received a report that could become decisive for the investigation. The most important details of the document were collected quickly, professionally, and without any doubts by the security service of the port in Victoria. According to their data, Brandon was at the Victoria Port Terminal on the evening of the 3rd of February, where he completed registration for the Coho ferry at 2000 hours. He went through the standard procedure, showed his ticket and driver's license, and then calmly climbed the gangway to the ship. The investigators carefully looked at the surveillance camera recordings in the terminal. Brandon's face is clearly recognizable in the video. He calmly crosses the terminal, stops nowhere for a conversation, passes the control zone, and boards the deck. The last camera captures him entering the ferry's dining hall exactly at 20:15. At first glance, everything looked flawless. Given the severity of the situation, however, Harris could not rely exclusively on video recordings. He had to personally verify that Brandon had not left the ferry. This information could only be confirmed by the crew. The detectives made contact with the ship's captain, who at this time was already preparing the ship for a new voyage. Harris briefly introduced himself, explained the importance of the situation, and asked for the release of the passenger boarding and disembarking registers. After a few minutes, the captain handed over to the police official documents that were certified with his personal signature. According to the ship's log, all passengers, including Brandon, had completed boarding by 20:25. At 20:30, the gangway was completely retracted. The ship cast off from the pier. Harris studied the reports attentively and noted that according to these records, it was impossible to disembark after the gangway was retracted. But the matter was too serious to trust only the paperwork. He turned again to the camera recordings, this time those that were already directly on the ferry. The recording of the camera in the dining hall captured Brandon at 23:05, almost at the moment when Naomi Coleman was already being filmed by the elevator camera with Ava in her arms. Brandon sat at a table in the corner of the hall and nervously rubbed his temples. From time to time, he checked his phone as if expecting a reply message. This behavior could mean much, but it did not confirm his physical presence in Edmonton. However, even such clear capture could be insufficient. Harris requested an additional check of Brandon's car, which stood in the parking lot in Victoria, not far from the terminal. The Victoria Police received instructions to check the vehicle for traces or signs that it had been used in recent hours. The search of the car was thorough, but nothing suspicious was found. The interior looked as if the owner had not entered it since parking. No traces, no personal items, nothing. Now the question posed itself differently. Could Brandon have somehow left the ship unnoticed and returned? Harris contacted the captain personally and asked for clarification of this point. The answer came immediately, confidently, and clearly. After retracting the boarding ramp and casting off from the pier, Any movement of passengers outside the ship is physically impossible. All decks were automatically closed, entrances blocked, until the moment of docking at the destination. Given the strict security regulations, the version of Brandon's secret departure was completely rejected. Thus, the version according to which Brandon could have been near Naomi's house at the time of the tragedy finally lost its relevance. His message, "I am outside." "Answer me now" no longer looked like emotional manipulation sent from a distance. Perhaps Brandon was troubled or annoyed about their recent conflict and simply wanted to draw Naomi's attention to himself. This hypothesis fit completely with his behavior on the video recording from the ferry, but was no longer of interest as a possible trail for the investigations. To conclude the investigation of Brandon's alibi, the ship's captain handed over to the police an official certificate that stated in black and white, "Passenger Brandon Nguyen was on board the ship Coho until docking at 23:45. Harris slowly placed this paper on the table and understood that the original suspicion had been wrong. Now, the detectives were forced to return to the starting point and reconsider the case, concentrating their attention on those who were directly in the apartment at the time of the tragedy. This meant only one thing. The investigations were about to begin from the beginning and reconsider the behavior and statements of the only person who was with Ava that night. Her mother, Naomi Coleman. The investigations return again to Edmonton, to the central figure of the story, Naomi Coleman. This time, attention focuses on the mysterious bruises that were discovered on Ava's skin. These marks had clearly formed long before the events of that fateful night. Why had they appeared if Ava did not attend sports clubs or courses? On the 5th of February, Detective Harris carefully studied Ava's medical records. In the reports of the district pediatrician, it stated that Naomi had approached him several times with complaints about bruises and small contusions. The pediatrician always entered the same sentence in the medical files. Bruises are explained by active games at home. Formally, all medical conclusions looked convincing and aroused no suspicions. However, these dry lines now took on a different meaning. In the course of verification, the detectives visited Naomi's neighbors in the residential complex. One of the first questioned was an elderly woman named Mrs. Lee, who lived behind the thin wall of the neighboring apartment. Her statements proved to be unexpectedly important. The woman found it difficult to find words, but claimed confidently. In recent weeks, she had often heard Ava's muffled crying. Sometimes this happened during the day, sometimes toward evening. But always the sounds were quiet, as if someone were trying to carefully hide them. When the investigator asked if she had heard the mother's voice or anyone else's, Mrs. Lee shook her head. Only Ava. She paid no great attention to this and considered it normal behavior at that age. Harris kept returning to the same question. If Ava did not engage in physical activities outside the house, where could these marks have come from? The doctors confirmed that bruises of this type normally result from careless falls or bumps against hard objects. But for them to appear with such regularity, either regular injuries or systematic external influence would have been necessary. To understand the situation more deeply, the investigation began to examine Ava's closer environment. It turned out that a week before the incident, the maternal grandmother had spent several days with her. As part of the standard procedure, the grandmother was summoned for a conversation. At the meeting, the woman seemed agitated, described in detail the days spent with Ava, and assured that the girl had not suffered any injuries while with her. She spoke sincerely and without hesitation. However, this was not sufficient to completely free her from suspicions. The grandmother's statements were important, but the investigations needed more evidence of her innocence. The woman provided photographs that had been taken with the mobile phone 3 days before the incident. Harris looked at these recordings for a long time and enlarged the image on the computer screen. In the photos, Ava was smiling and looked completely happy. But most importantly, on her skin, there were no visible traces or bruises. This meant that the bruises on the girl's body had formed later in the last 3 days before the tragedy. The investigations understood that the grandmother was temporarily removed from the list of suspects, although her complete exclusion was premature. Meanwhile, the investigators gained access to a new batch of medical reports. It was noted there that the bruises were of different ages, but the most conspicuous had formed no more than 72 hours before the fateful day. Harris carefully compared this data with Naomi's statements. She continued to assure that the bruises had resulted from falls at home, but the tone of her voice and word choice became increasingly less convincing. The detectives also returned once again to the large plush bear that had been confiscated from the apartment's storage room. Its hard plastic eyes could have left exactly such specific pressure marks on the skin. The investigations understood that the toy could play an important role in the case, although no clear conclusions had yet been drawn. Toward the end of the day, while reviewing another report, Harris noticed a forensic medical expert's opinion. There, it was clearly stated that the position and character of the old bruises could not be accidental. But the most disturbing thing was something else. The experts refused to definitively claim that these injuries were the result of domestic violence, but did not exclude such a possibility. The document ended with a standard reservation that clarified nothing definitively, but gave the investigations reason for serious concern. Now the investigators knew that the bruises on Ava's body had formed quite recently and their origin was disturbing. The grandmother temporarily left the detectives' field of view, but remained a figure who should not be forgotten. As for Naomi, she was about to explain in detail once again what had happened in the apartment during Ava's last days of life. The investigations delved deeper and deeper into the details of Naomi Coleman's family life and understood that the secrets she was hiding could be much more terrible and closer than it had initially seemed. On the third day after the tragedy, a new important detail drew the investigation's attention. Crime scene technicians discovered a fresh imprint of a small palm on the inside of the cabinet handle in Naomi Coleman's apartment. It was barely visible, but significant. Where it came from there, and how it was connected to the events of that night, remained to be discovered. The experts arrived at Naomi's apartment in the morning, 3 days after the incident. Investigator Harris accompanied them and silently observed as the criminalists methodically examined every surface. Everyone's attention was drawn to a tall built-in cabinet with a wooden door. The specialist slowly ran a brush with powder over the inside of the handle, and soon a small but completely clear palm print appeared on it clearly. Harris approached and examined the find attentively. Next to the imprint, small scratches and several microscopic wood splinters could be seen, which clearly indicated that someone had tried with force to hold onto the handle. The investigators carefully measured the height at which this imprint was located, 110 centimeters from the floor. According to medical records, Ava's height was 93 centimeters. It seemed obvious that Ava could not have reached the cabinet handle without outside help. Nevertheless, the imprint was completely accurate and belonged to her. This contradiction became central to the new investigation version. The investigations considered the possibility that Ava could have reached the handle with the help of some support. The detectives carefully examined the floor and the area around the cabinet. Toys, books, and other small objects lay scattered in several places. Theoretically, Ava could have stacked them on top of each other and tried to reach. This version seemed plausible and became the working version for the investigations. However, Harris personally decided to check such a possibility. He carefully placed large toys on the floor next to the cabinet and tried to create a kind of stable support. The resulting construction looked too fragile, but the investigator was obligated to carry the experiment through to the end. He stepped back one step and invited a crime scene technician to confirm or refute this theory. After several careful attempts, it was clear. Holding oneself on such objects was practically impossible. They collapsed immediately. The version looked doubtful but was not yet completely excluded. In parallel, a new hypothesis emerged. Ava could have locked herself in the cabinet while playing hide and seek. This could explain the imprint and the scratches. The girl could have become frightened and tried to open the door from inside. At first glance, this explained the traces found. But Harris was an experienced enough investigator not to trust words. He stepped up to the cabinet again and examined its door attentively. A lock on the cabinet was missing, but the door was heavy enough and fit tightly against the frame. Opening it from inside could have been too difficult a task for Ava. The experts took measurements again and conducted a series of tests to determine whether she could have independently closed the door and remained locked in. The results were ambiguous. Theoretically, it was possible, but practical confirmation of such a version was lacking. The investigator asked the crime scene technician to demonstrate at what height Ava could have reached the handle if she had stood on tiptoes. The expert carefully measured the distance. Even on tiptoes, with her arm stretched upward, she was missing at least 12 centimeters to reach the cabinet handle. This discovery immediately crossed out the hypothesis that Ava could have locked herself in. The investigations were forced to acknowledge the cabinet door was closed by an adult. Harris stepped back one step and calmly studied the cabinet, understanding the full seriousness of the situation. Now the circle of suspects was sharply narrowed. Brandon had long had a reliable alibi. Ava's grandmother was temporarily excluded from the suspects because of convincing photographs that proved her innocence. There remained only one figure who was physically capable of closing the cabinet door: Naomi Coleman, Ava's mother. The investigator did not hurry to draw final conclusions, but it was obvious that the evidence was increasingly coming together against Naomi. He looked again at the found imprint of the small palm, covered with barely visible scratches, and understood that Ava had desperately tried to open the cabinet from the inside. This became not just a trace. This was a clear signal that could not be ignored. Now the investigators faced returning to Naomi again and finding out what she had hidden. But this time, the detectives knew exactly what to pay attention to in her narrative. On the fourth day of the investigation, the investigators carefully studied the laptop that had been confiscated in Naomi Coleman's apartment. The detectives' special attention was drawn to a Zoom recording found in the device's memory. It became important to understand what exactly happened on the screen during that period in which the tragedy presumably took place. Detective Harris sat in the office and attentively studied the detailed report about the data obtained from Naomi's computer. According to the Zoom protocols, Naomi participated in an online interview on the evening of the 3rd of February. The meeting began at 22:55 and initially aroused no suspicions. Everything proceeded evenly and quietly until 23:02, when Naomi unexpectedly turned off the microphone. The application clearly recorded the activation of the mute mode. At 23:03, the video was manually paused. These manipulations coincided completely in time with the critical events that were captured by the camera in the elevator. The detective looked at this information several times, without hurrying to draw conclusions. It was obvious that Naomi herself interrupted the video connection. Experts confirmed the recording did not stop because of a technical error, but as a result of direct actions by the user. Harris felt that this detail could become a key trace in the investigation. Understanding the importance of the moment, the investigator again invited Naomi for a conversation. The woman looked tired and tense and avoided direct glances. When Harris asked her why she had manually stopped the video, Naomi paused and then answered calmly that she allegedly suddenly lost the internet. This version was logical and simple, but for the investigation, too convenient. Harris decided to check her words directly through Zoom's technical support. An official inquiry was immediately sent, and after a few hours the answer came. No connection problems at the time of the video conference were recorded. Naomi's internet channel was absolutely stable. The system registered no failures. This information became a serious contradiction in the suspect's words. Naomi claimed that the video connection was accidentally interrupted due to connection loss. However, the detectives now knew exactly that this was a lie. This fact left her no room for maneuver, although the investigation still drew no hasty conclusions. Harris noted this as a closed false trail and continued searching for an explanation for her actions. In parallel, the investigation team checked the recordings of the hallway cameras at the time of the video shutdown. These cameras captured the entire hallway that led from the apartment to the elevator. The recordings showed no foreign person or movement except Naomi herself. The camera clearly showed that in the time between the two key elevator recordings that captured Naomi with Ava, and then Naomi alone with lifeless Ava in her arms, no one entered or left the apartment. This excluded the possibility of any other person's involvement in the events. Harris understood that each new fact made Naomi's version increasingly less convincing. The lie that earlier could only look like an attempt to avoid unpleasant questions now transformed into a serious trace. However, the detective did not hurry to draw loud conclusions. He had to collect the complete picture and understand why Naomi urgently had to turn off camera and microphone at that moment. Toward evening of the same day, sitting at the work desk in the precinct, Harris returned to the details of the Zoom report. The time of stopping the video recording and microphone shutdown matched perfectly with the period between the two recordings of the elevator camera. He slowly closed his eyes and compared each detail. If Naomi could earlier still try to explain her actions through simple coincidence, her version now looked completely destroyed. Harris played the hallway recording again. The recordings were clear and continuous. No one except Naomi was there. He looked at the large monitor on which the chronology of events was displayed and recognized that what happened in the apartment could no longer be explained by coincidence. Naomi had consciously turned off video and sound and was hiding something that happened behind the camera. Now the investigation only had to find out what exactly Naomi sought to hide when she turned off Zoom. The answer to this question could be the final key to solving the entire story. 5 days after the tragedy, the investigation's attention turned again to the details of that night. When checking the surveillance recordings on the 18th floor of the residential complex, the detectives discovered an unexpected anomaly. The lighting in the hallway was completely turned off for exactly 1 hour, from 22:30 to 23:30. The question of who and why had done this became a new important task of the investigation. The first person Detective Harris summoned for questioning was the security guard of the residential complex, 24-year-old Robert Fong. The young man looked noticeably agitated but spoke confidently and tried to hide nothing. Harris began the interrogation carefully, without pressure, and simply asked him to explain why the lighting on the 18th floor was turned off exactly that evening. Robert answered calmly that he was carrying out an order from the residents of apartment number 1708. In the building's technical maintenance register, there was indeed an official note: shutdown of lighting on the 18th floor for energy savings, at the request of residents of apartment number 1708. The order had been placed on time and processed completely correctly. Harris studied the register page attentively and then asked why Robert had not found the light shut down strange. The guard answered that such orders were usual practice, especially on weekends. The detective understood, however, the coincidence was too suspicious to simply take it at face value. The next step was checking all residents of apartment 1708, the Ruiz family. They had already lived on this floor for 3 years and had not previously come into the police's view. Harris went to them personally to clarify the situation. The Ruiz couple told without any hesitation that they were at a party at friends in Richmond that evening. They confirmed their words with taxi receipts and an alcohol test that had been conducted by traffic police on the way back. The statements and documents matched perfectly, and the version of the Ruiz family's involvement was completely dismissed. Now a new question arose. If the residents of apartment 1708 were at another location that evening, who exactly could have used the darkness in the hallway and for what purpose? Harris returned to the guard, Robert, and asked him to explain exactly how the lighting was turned off and how the surveillance cameras functioned during this. Robert claimed confidently that the shutdown was performed remotely through the central security console, with the cameras automatically switching to infrared mode. The recording continued, but already without color lighting, only in black and white version. This meant that despite complete darkness for human eyes, the cameras continued to capture every movement in the hallway. The version that the residents of apartment 1708 were somehow connected with the night's events was quickly closed. The statements and documents confirming their absence aroused no doubts. The detectives wasted no more time checking this version and concentrated on another direction. Harris carefully watched the infrared camera recordings in the hallway for the entire hour of light shutdown. Initially, the image was motionless, and only weak silhouettes of doors and walls reminded that the recording was continuing. But exactly at 23 o'clock, the infrared camera clearly captured movement. Harris slowed the playback and increased the screen brightness to recognize details. Soon, he clearly saw a figure moving from Naomi Coleman's apartment toward the storage room. The figure was familiar. It could without doubt be identified as Naomi herself. She moved quickly but carefully, clearly holding something voluminous in her hands. After careful image examination, it became clear that it was a large plush toy. That bear with hard plastic eyes that was later found in the storage room. Harris froze before the screen, did not move, and barely blinked. In his head, the complete picture quickly came together. The turned-off light, the order placed in advance, the complete darkness that Naomi counted on, and her movement through the hallway with the toy that would later become an important trace. All this pointed to only one thing. Naomi had thought through and prepared in advance the conditions under which she could act unnoticed. Harris slowly leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, and put together the entire chain of events. The puzzle was gradually forming into a whole picture from which coincidences disappeared and a clear and calculated plan appeared. Now it was understandable that Naomi used the darkness prepared in advance for a movement that should not be noticed by ordinary residents. She counted on the cameras not fully capturing her actions, without suspecting that they switched to infrared mode. The detective understood that he was getting closer step by step to solving the whole story. Now he knew exactly that Naomi Coleman had done everything possible to keep the events of that night hidden from foreign eyes. But the evidence was not on her side, and the next meeting with the investigators could become decisive. The 8th day of the investigation brought a new important clue that could completely explain the formation of 2 symmetrical bruises on Ava Coleman's neck. These markings had been the subject of special attention in the investigation from the first days. Now the detectives had to determine how they had formed and who was involved in their formation. The morning of the 15th of February began with an important experiment in the Forensic Expertise Laboratory. In the middle of the room, on a sterile table, lay that large plush bear that had been found earlier in Naomi Coleman's storage room. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Samantha Williams, carefully took the plastic eye of the toy and gently placed it against the photo of the bruises on Ava's neck. The match proved to be practically perfect. Shape, size, and even the distance between the bruises corresponded completely to the distance between the bear's eyes. The verification did not end there. Forensic technicians carefully examined the fabric of Ava's pajamas in which she had been found that night. Experts looked at the fibers under a strong microscope and soon discovered what they were looking for: tiny hairs, identical to the hair of the toy bear. These fibers were found exactly on the collar of Ava's pajamas, in immediate proximity to her neck. Now it became clear that the toy was not only near Ava at the time of the tragedy, but had direct contact with her neck. This detail changed the whole picture of events and opened a new important version of what happened to the investigation. However, the next logical question arose before Harris and his team. Was this bear really capable of leading to such serious consequences? Were its weight and construction sufficient to cause such damage? Only a specialist could answer this question. Doctor. Williams listened emotionlessly to Harris's question and gave a brief and clear answer. Yes, provided that an adult's hand acted upon the bear. She explained that the weight of the toy alone was not sufficient for complete blockage of the airways, but with moderate pressure from an adult hand, the plastic of the eyes could easily leave exactly those traces that were found on Ava's neck. Harris listened attentively to the expert and recognized the full importance of these words. For the first time in the case, a solid medical foundation appeared that confirmed the actions that led to the tragic consequences. Despite the convincingness of the expert testimony, Naomi's defense attempted to explain the found traces through an accidental fall of the toy. The lawyer expressed the assumption that Ava could have accidentally let the heavy bear fall on herself, which led to the formation of characteristic bruises on her neck. To verify this version, a detailed judicial reconstruction was organized. The investigation arranged a classic experimental verification of the defense hypothesis. Forensic experts reproduced several variants of the possible bear fall from various heights. In each experiment, the impact force was carefully measured and the results were documented. After a series of tests, Dr. Williams summarized the experimental results before Harris and the investigation team. According to the obtained data, when the bear fell from vertical position from the height of Ava's size, the impact force proved to be about twice lower than that which could have led to such deep and distinct bruises. The experts came to a clear conclusion. The defense's version does not withstand criticism and is not confirmed by physical measurements. Harris looked again at the photos of the bruises and understood that now nothing more could justify the randomness of what happened. The toy, which the investigation had considered as an auxiliary clue until this moment, became the central part of the mechanism that an adult used to commit the crime. The investigation finally established that the plush bear was used not only as a pressure object, but also as a kind of silencer that suppressed any sounds. Now the investigators knew exactly that Naomi was the only adult person who could physically use this toy in such a way. Before Detective Harris now lay indisputable evidence that irrefutably connected Naomi Coleman with the tragedy in her apartment. Naomi could no longer deny the obvious, but the investigators knew that the final step of the investigation would be the most difficult and responsible. The 11th day of the investigation came. Now the investigation had all the necessary facts and evidence at hand. But there remained one important question that could finally put everything in its place. Naomi Coleman's mental state and her intentions at the time of the incident. On the 18th of February, a meeting took place at the Edmonton police station between Investigator Harris and the leading forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Andrew Jenkins. On the table before Harris lay an official psychiatric report on Naomi Coleman's condition, compiled based on the results of extensive interviews and examinations. The report was clear and laconic, although its formulations raised many questions. Dr. Jenkins confirmed that Naomi had been under the influence of chronic stress for a long time. She was prone to abrupt affective outbursts in which she lost emotional control. However, the psychiatrist emphasized one most important fact. Despite these manifestations, Naomi retained full sanity and the ability to recognize the consequences of her actions. In other words, her condition could not be used to justify the actions she committed that evening. On the same day, another interrogation of Naomi took place. It was quiet in the room, and Harris listened attentively to every word. The question was simple and direct. Why had she applied physical influence with the help of the toy? Naomi answered calmly and evenly, avoiding direct eye contact. I needed quiet. Just for 10 minutes. In her voice, there was neither remorse nor excitement, only fatigue and irritation. To the question of whether she had recognized the possible consequences, Naomi answered coldly, I only pressed with the toy so that Ava would sit quietly. I did not want to harm her. Naomi's answer opened a new turn for the defense. Her lawyer immediately used his client's statement and explained to the investigation that Naomi's actions were caused exclusively by panic and emotional outburst. He claimed that Naomi could not recognize the strength of the pressure she was applying. This version sounded convincing, and the investigation was obligated to check it most thoroughly. Harris turned to experts again. Medical specialists explained that emotional outburst and panic can indeed lead to uncontrolled actions. In Naomi's case, however, given her psychological profile, she could well recognize and control the force with which she applied pressure. The most important argument was that, according to the psychiatric report, she had not lost the ability to control her actions. However, the defense continued to insist on its version, emphasizing that Naomi was in a state of unpredictable panic and could not be responsible for her actions. For the court and the investigation, this version looked convincing enough to hold a special hearing at which video materials were examined that captured Naomi's behavior immediately after what happened. At the hearing in court, all eyes were directed at the screen on which the recording from the elevator camera was transmitted. The timing was set with special precision. The recording began exactly at the moment when Naomi left the apartment and headed to the elevator with the lifeless Ava in her arms. The judge and jurors attentively observed Naomi's facial expression on the video. On the screen, it could be seen that she looked tense but absolutely calm. No panic or uncontrolled emotions could be recognized in her face. Specialists noted separately one important detail. According to the recording, it could be precisely determined that the first signs of panic in Naomi appeared only 8 minutes after the Zoom shutdown. This meant that Naomi had enough time available to recognize what had happened. Such behavior clearly did not correspond to the defense version about sudden panic. Tense silence reigned in the courtroom. Now the prosecution had a weighty and irrefutable argument that proved Naomi's actions were conscious and controlled. Detective Harris quietly made a note in his notebook. The defense version about panic was rapidly losing credibility, and the investigation was approaching the final and decisive stage. Now the investigation had everything to finally put a period in the Naomi Coleman case. On the 27th of January 2025, almost a year after the tragic events, all participants of this loud and sensational case gathered in the Edmonton courtroom. Naomi Coleman listened motionlessly to the verdict. The judge read calmly and evenly the final decision and declared her guilty under 2 articles of the Canadian Criminal Code, paragraph 236 and paragraph 218. All details of the investigation finally came together and formed a complete and flawless picture. The court proceedings lasted several months. Each hearing carefully dissected individual episodes and evidence. One of the key moments of the trial became the demonstration of the detailed chronology of that night before the court. The shutdown of the Zoom video call, which was initially explained by Naomi as an accident, was recognized by the court as an attempt to hide Ava's sounds. Experts confirmed that the microphone was turned off consciously, manually, and there were no network failures. The reconstruction of events presented by criminal technicians also became indisputable evidence. Specialists showed the court clearly how Ava's height did not allow her to independently reach the cabinet handle. Naomi's version that Ava could lock herself in was refuted by a clear and dry demonstration of the impossibility of such actions. The statements of the forensic medical examiner, who confirmed the identity of form and size of the bruises on Ava's neck with the plastic eyes of the toy bear, proved to be decisive. The court recognized that Naomi used the toy to suppress the sounds that Ava could have made. The fiber traces of the toy found on the pajamas became the last detail that definitively solidified the evidence. Brandon Nguyen's alibi was completely confirmed, and his message recognized as only an attempt at emotional pressure from Naomi's side. The investigations cleared him of all suspicions and officially closed this line of investigation. At the final court hearing, Naomi still tried to insist on the version of the accident. The lawyers spoke of panic and emotional instability. But the court demonstrated once more the recordings of the camera in the elevator and video materials of the infrared camera in the hallway, where it could be seen how Naomi moved completely calmly through the apartment and hallway several minutes after the Zoom disconnection. The court established that her panic occurred much later and clearly was not the first reaction. The final and decisive argument became the physical reconstruction of events by forensic medical examiners. They demonstrated that an accidental fall of the toy could not have produced such pressure that was determined on Ava's neck. This reconstruction completely destroyed all remaining arguments of the defense. After complete consideration of all circumstances and evidence, the judge announced the final verdict. Naomi Coleman was sentenced to 17 years of imprisonment with mandatory subsequent psychiatric supervision. The verdict was read evenly and dryly without any emotional comments. Despite the clarity and completeness of the verdict, some moments of the case remained behind closed doors. The question of whether there had been earlier episodes of violence remained unanswered for the public and was classified in the case materials under the heading of restricted access. Under the same heading, the history of the formation of earlier hematomas on Ava's body was closed. These data were not expressed in court and remained internal information of the investigations. The story of Ava Coleman, which began with an ordinary evening and ended with a tragedy, was fully revealed only in official documents. Many details will never become accessible to the general public, but the investigations and the court did everything possible to reconstruct the events as objectively as possible. For Detective Michael Harris, this case was closed. Now it lay among many other folders in the archive of the court department and waited only for silent preservation. The disappearance of Alice Novotná occurred suddenly, in broad daylight, directly on the territory of the kindergarten, with completely closed gates and surrounded by adults. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, and the circumstances of what happened looked almost impossible from the first minutes. 11:05 in the morning, kindergarten, Slunečko, small Czech town, Most. Clear weather, ordinary weekday. Teacher Jana Sukupova takes out for a walk a group of 12 charges. The counting of pupils, according to her words, was conducted several times. But already after a few minutes, it becomes obvious. 3-year-old Alice Novotná has disappeared. The gate leading outside is closed with a latch from the inside. There are no other exits. Cameras are also not installed on the territory of the garden. All that can be learned are the words of employees, which almost immediately begin to contradict each other. Police officers, who arrived at the scene already 15 minutes after the call, record several unusual details. The first thing that investigators pay attention to is the playground of the garden. The sand looks wet, as if it had recently been watered with a hose. This is strange. The weather has been dry for the last few days. There has been no rain for more than 3 days. Forensic experts immediately note this could have been done specifically to hide traces. Teacher Jana Sukupova, who first reported Alice's disappearance, looks confused and frightened. According to her words, Alice was literally nearby, and suddenly, she was not there. Jana claims that she turned away literally for a minute, checking the list of children. Her voice trembles. Testimony is confused and emotional. The second employee, Teresa Horakova, on the contrary, behaves restrainedly, even dryly. Almost indifferently, she repeats the same phrase. "I saw nothing. I was busy preparing lunch." Her testimony does not change and sounds memorized. Investigators record this discrepancy and decide to return to both women later. One of the first real clues becomes the video surveillance camera recording on a neighboring private house, located across Studnična Street, approximately 80 meters from the garden gate. The camera recorded a white Škoda Fabia car moving slowly along the street exactly at the moment of the incident. The license plate of the car is partially smeared with dirt, but the make and color are clearly distinguishable. The recording immediately gets into the focus of police attention. Half an hour after the disappearance, a witness appears, a local resident who was passing by the garden at approximately 11 in the morning. He reports to police that he noticed near the garden fence a man who was behaving unusually. The eyewitness did not see the face, but described the stranger as tall, thin, in dark clothing, presumably middle-aged. The man looked over the fence several times, was nervous, after which he quickly departed towards Studnična Street. Simultaneously, they check the identity of the nearest neighbor of the garden, 36-year-old Petr Kovarik. The man is unemployed, previously convicted for property theft. His house is located just 100 meters from the garden. Neighbors repeatedly complained about his behavior and suspected him of petty thefts. Police promptly arrive at his home, but Kovarik is not there. The house is inspected with permission of the police commissioner. However, nothing suspicious is immediately discovered. After several hours, the situation with Kovarik begins to clear up. Checking recordings and testimonies of local residents, police find out the evening before the man was indeed near the garden. But exactly at the moment of Alice's disappearance, he was in another district, where he was visiting the social assistance department. This is confirmed documentarily and by employee testimonies. The version of his involvement in the incident is discarded. Kovarik is temporarily excluded from the list of suspects. Meanwhile, city police direct several crews to search for the mysterious Skoda Fabia. The car presumably could belong to the kidnapper, or at minimum, a witness to what happened. By evening, the first results of surveillance camera checks show the Skoda Fabia car was moving not just past the garden. During 20 minutes before the incident, it several times slowly drove along Studniczna Street, each time reducing speed near the entrance to the garden. The last time it was noticed was exactly at 11:05, at the exact moment of Alice's disappearance. Then the car sharply accelerated and disappeared around the turn. The route of the car is restored only partially. The last time the Skoda was recorded by city surveillance camera in the area of the bridge over the Bilina River, approximately 600 meters from the kindergarten. The further path of the car remains unknown. The investigation takes a new turn. Now the key element of the case becomes the search for the mysterious car and its driver. After Petr Kovarik's alibi was checked by police, they stopped considering him the direct culprit of Alice Novotna's disappearance. But suspicions toward this person remained. The fact is that some facts still did not add up to a complete picture, and Kovarik's behavior itself raised questions. The next day, after the incident, police decided to study Petr's movements in more detail. In the morning, information came from the bus transportation company. A ticket to the bus to the city of Ústí nad Labem, located 60 kilometers from Most, was recorded. The camera recording at the station confirms that Kovarik purchased a personal ticket for the bus at 10:45, approximately 20 minutes before Alice's disappearance. His identity was confirmed by ID card. Formally, this was enough to temporarily remove the main suspicions from him. However, investigators were troubled by one circumstance. The time between buying the ticket and the actual departure of the bus was sufficient to make a short return to the kindergarten and again go away to the station. In addition, from his house to the garden was only about 100 meters. To better understand what was happening, police again visited Kovarik's dwelling, this time with official permission for thorough inspection. At first glance, there was nothing suspicious in the house itself. Ordinary furniture, modest living conditions, no luxury or things indicating connections to crime. But police attention was attracted by the attic. On the floor, next to old things and worn furniture, investigator František Benes noticed a children's doll, carefully hidden in the corner. On the doll's dress, the embroidered initials AN clearly stood out. The very fact of discovering such an object at a previously convicted man's place instantly turned the course of the investigation. Police immediately sent the doll for forensic examination. The following night was filled with tense waiting. Investigators hoped to get weighty evidence against Kovarik. However, in the morning, the examination result presented an unexpected turn. DNA of an unknown woman was discovered on the doll. This sample did not belong to Alice herself. The news about the find and examination results quickly spread among police officers. Someone already considered this trail a random coincidence. Someone insisted on digging deeper. Criminalists assumed that the doll could belong to a completely different person and end up with Kovarik by accident. But this only emphasized another strangeness. Why would a man living alone, without family, keep such a thing on his attic? Meanwhile, other operatives continued studying details of Kovarik's route on the day of Alice's disappearance. Checking city video surveillance cameras showed that after buying the ticket, the man briefly left the station and returned back again. This confirmed the possibility of his appearance near the garden at approximately the right time. Police repeatedly conducted a survey of local residents, Neighbors on the street described Kovarik as a person who was closed and uncommunicative, spending most of his time at home or on the street, watching passers-by. One of the neighbors noted that several weeks before what happened, the man began appearing more often at the kindergarten fence, spending time there without apparent reason. Investigation suspicions were not finally dispelled, although there were no formal grounds to detain Kovarik. Police officers only noted in protocols that the man's behavior remains suspicious and requires further checking. The identity of the woman whose DNA was found on the doll also remained unknown, and investigators decided to search for her in parallel, assuming that this could explain at least part of the strangeness around Petr Kovarik. Meanwhile, Alice Novotna's parents, Tomas and Katerina, at this time did not give police peace, demanding to accelerate the search and check every suspicious person in the area. The missing girl's family was sure that the man noticed by the witness near the fence and Kovarik were the same person. But proving this with direct evidence had not yet been possible. The police decided to temporarily keep Kovarik under passive surveillance, maintaining his status as a suspect, although they could not present him with official charges. The investigation gradually shifted focus, planning to delve deeper into studying the environment of Alice herself and her family. However, nobody forgot about the strange doll in the attic and the mysterious stranger whose genetic material was found on it. The investigation continued, gradually expanding the circle of people being checked. But the name of Petr Kovarik still remained one of the main ones, around which many inconsistencies and questions revolved. The investigation did not let go of the thread connected with Petr Kovarik, but in parallel, attention also switched to another side of the story: the environment of Alice Novotna's family. The deeper the police penetrated into the personal lives of Alice's parents, the more inconsistencies and suspicious details emerged. Tomas and Katarzyna Novotny, parents of the missing Alice, initially looked like an absolutely ordinary family. Tomas, an engineer by profession, a man with an impeccable reputation, actively helped the police from the first minutes of the search. Katarzyna worked as an accountant in a small local company and also always willingly communicated with investigators. But exactly 2 days after Alice's disappearance, the police encountered information that the family carefully concealed. Early in the morning on April 14th, during a repeated questioning, Inspector František Beneš asked Tomáš whether he or his wife had received any threats lately. The man's reaction was unusual. First he fell silent, and then reluctantly admitted that exactly 1 week before Alice's disappearance, several strange letters had arrived at his personal email. The sender used an anonymous Swiss service proton mail, known for its confidentiality and data protection. The first letter contained a short phrase: "You must take Alice from the garden. Do it immediately." The letter looked too general to take it seriously, so Tomáš immediately deleted it, considering it ordinary spam. However, 2 days later, a second message arrived, written more harshly: "Take your daughter from the garden. This is the last warning." The man again preferred to ignore the warning, believing that it was someone's unsuccessful joke or attempt at intimidation. When asked by the investigator why he did not immediately report the threats to the police, Tomáš answered dryly and honestly. He did not want to sow panic in the family and was absolutely certain that his family could not have serious enemies. In light of the new information, the police immediately initiated a check of the electronic letters. Computer experts established that the letters were indeed sent through the anonymous proton mail server. Tracking the sender directly proved impossible. But the police continued working and launched a deep IP trace, trying to find at least some digital lead. Simultaneously, the investigation turned attention to Tomáš's professional activity. Soon it became clear that 2 weeks before Alice's disappearance, he had entered into an open conflict with a colleague at the engineering firm, 42-year-old Robert Gajdoš. The cause of the conflict was a patent for a new device developed by Tomáš. Robert tried to challenge the authorship of the patent, believing that the engineer had used his ideas. The meeting ended in a heated argument, witnessed by several employees of the firm. Police suspicions intensified after it became clear that Robert Gajdosz had gone on vacation precisely on the day of Alice's disappearance. The investigators decided to conduct an urgent interrogation of Gajdosz, assuming that the conflict could have served as a reason for threats and possibly had a connection with the incident. However, the version that engineer Gajdosz could have been behind the anonymous letters soon began to look doubtful. Robert himself, during the interrogation, looked genuinely surprised by the news about threats and Alice's disappearance, willingly provided the police with access to his email and work computer. No traces indicating his involvement were found. Meanwhile, the results of IP tracing of the letters became available to police specialists. These results completely changed the direction of the investigation. It turned out that the letters were sent through a public Wi-Fi access point located in direct proximity to the kindergarten silеnse. This fact clearly made it clear that the sender of the letters, whoever he was physically close to the place of Alice's disappearance. Now there was no doubt, the threats were real, but the sender's motive remained unclear. The Novotny family was not wealthy, had no serious conflicts or debts, except for a minor quarrel at work, which did not fit such harsh warnings and especially actions. The police did not exclude that the threats could have been a kind of trap for the parents to distract the investigation in another direction. In other words, for now, this was just another shadow among many versions. Nevertheless, the new discovery forced the police to significantly change the investigation strategy. It was decided to re-examine the area around the garden, now with a focus on searching for any physical evidence that the sender of threats might have left. Peter Kovacic still remained under surveillance, and the police were in no hurry to exclude him from suspects. Now, however, a new unknown figure appeared in the investigation, who clearly watched the Novotny family and could turn out to be much closer than the investigators assumed. 5 days of tense searches gave no results. The city of Most lived in constant expectation. Investigators checked already studied routes and evidence several times until the morning of April 17th, when an emergency message arrived. A volunteer diver named Karol Szydło reported that he had found Alice Novotna. The remains were discovered in the Bilina River not far from the bridge, in a place that had already been examined repeatedly earlier. Diver Karol Szydło became a new and important witness. He told the police that he discovered the remains completely by accident and in a place that seemed strange, as if someone had specifically thrown them closer to the shore, where the depth was minimal. External examination confirmed the volunteers' suspicions. The river current was too weak to carry the remains precisely here. The version of dumping became the main one from the first minutes after the discovery. Investigators promptly arrived at the scene. External examination gave new, critically important evidence. On Alice's forehead, a fresh hematoma was clearly visible. The initial version of drowning immediately began to look unlikely. The pathologist expert called to the scene cautiously concluded, the hematoma was received before entering the water and could not have appeared in a simple accident on the river. Alice's hair turned out to be tangled, and criminalists discovered microparticles of paint in it. Primary analysis showed that the paint was identical to that which had recently painted the fence of the kindergarten silеnse. This evidence unambiguously indicated that the crime scene was precisely in the garden area, not on the river. The police immediately began checking the area near the bridge and the shoreline for traces, but another discovery quickly destroyed the initial logic of the investigation. Experts confirmed there were no traces of dragging or carrying remains on the shore. Moreover, the soil at the discovery site was soft and wet. Any movement would have left obvious prints. This meant only one thing: the remains were delivered here by another means. A car became the most likely option. This version was quickly confirmed by observations from city surveillance cameras. The police reconstructed the chronology of movement of all cars passing by the bridge at night. Special attention was again drawn to the already familiar white Skoda Fabia. The car appeared on one of the city surveillance cameras at 3:17 in the morning, moved slowly with headlights off, clearly trying not to attract attention. The car disappeared from view for 11 minutes, after which it was again spotted already leaving the river area. The press instantly picked up the story, actively promoting the version that some unknown criminal could have been operating in the city, who first delivered a blow and then tried to hide traces by dumping the remains in the river. The police officially neither confirmed nor denied this hypothesis, cautiously calling it just one of many. The expert group reported that the river was only a place of concealment, not the place of the crime itself. The cause of Alice's death was named as traumatic brain injury. In light of the new discoveries, investigators again returned to questioning kindergarten staff. Special attention was paid to teachers Jana Suchkova and Teresa Horakova, whose testimonies initially raised doubts and looked contradictory. Also began a repeated check of surveillance cameras and equipment belonging to garden staff, with special emphasis on their personal cars. At the same time, the police strictly kept investigation details secret, avoiding public statements that could provoke panic in the city. Peter Kovacic remained under suspicion. Although no direct evidence against him had appeared, investigators did not rule out his connection to the white car and the general chain of events. The bus alibi seemed to protect him reliably, but the police deliberately kept the man under control, checking every step and contact. Elisa's family at this time completely closed itself off from the press. The father, Tomasz Nowotny, experienced strong pangs of conscience, understanding that he had ignored serious threats that had come shortly before his daughter's disappearance. Nevertheless, no one in the family could explain who and why could have committed such a crime, if the family did not possess significant wealth or obvious enemies. Thus, the find on the Bylina River gave the investigation the most important answers to some questions, but at the same time gave rise to many new ones. Investigators already knew the exact cause of what happened and the place from where the tragic cargo had been delivered. Only one thing remained to be found out. Who exactly was behind the wheel of the car that quietly and unnoticeably approached the river in the darkness of night? After the discovery of Elisa's remains on the Bylina River, investigators sharply narrowed the circle of suspects. Peter Kovacic, previously the main suspect, completely came out from under suspicion. His alibi was confirmed finally and unconditionally by camera recordings and bus tickets, and the police officially removed all charges from him. However, Kovacic's place was quickly taken by another person who had been in the field of view from the very beginning but had always remained in the background, Jana Sukupova, a teacher at the Slunechko kindergarten. The reason for this was the internal surveillance camera recordings of the kindergarten for the 12th of April. In the period from 10:55 to 11:15, Jana suddenly disappears from the frame for exactly 9 minutes, despite the fact that, according to her own words, she was with the group of pupils all this time. Investigators checked the logs of the kindergarten's intercom system and found out that a minute before Elisa's disappearance, the door to the basement was opened with an electronic key assigned to Jana. When asked by police what exactly she was doing in the basement during working hours, Jana answered quickly but extremely uncertainly. She claimed that she was forced to urgently go for clean linen for one of the pupils who was feeling unwell. To confirm her words, the teacher showed investigators an SMS message sent at the same moment to a colleague. "Check the children. I have something urgent." Nevertheless, this message in no way explained why the trip for linen took a whole 9 minutes and why the teacher had not mentioned this fact earlier when giving testimony. The kindergarten basement was not within the field of view of surveillance cameras, which additionally complicated the investigation. The investigation's attention intensified when forensic experts examined the premises and discovered signs of recent thorough cleaning with the use of bleach. Blood traces, partially washed away with chemical agents, were found in the corner of the basement, next to old cabinets with household equipment. Experts quickly conducted a preliminary analysis of the samples and confirmed the main thing: the blood matched Alisa Novotna's DNA. This information was immediately strictly classified and did not reach the media, so as not to cause unnecessary excitement and not provoke suspects into reckless actions. Now, Jana Sukupova was not just a suspect. She became the main object of the investigation. Investigators returned to studying the teacher's biography. 37-year-old Jana had worked at the kindergarten for more than 7 years. Colleagues characterized her positively, calling her responsible and benevolent. Nevertheless, it soon became clear that hidden problems existed in the collective, which they preferred not to speak about aloud. Jana herself persistently insisted that she knew nothing about Alisa's disappearance and tried to justify her behavior that day exclusively with care for another pupil's health. However, during interrogations, the police got the impression that she was hiding something. Her answers were evasive, sometimes contradictory, and her behavior noticeably nervous. This looked strange for a person who was not involved in the tragic events. Police carefully studied Jana's movements on the night before the discovery of Alisa's remains. Although there was no direct evidence of her presence at the Bilina River at that moment, the mystery of the Škoda Fabia car remained unsolved. Investigators established that Jana had exactly such a car. Experts decided to check her automobile for traces capable of confirming or excluding her participation in transporting the remains. However, the results of this examination remained closed even to many police officers. Investigators also interrogated Teresa Horakova, Jana's colleague, but her testimony brought no clarity. Teresa claimed that at the moment of the incident she indeed received a message from Jana. However, she did not know why exactly she was leaving the group and why she was absent for so long. Teresa held herself coldly, without excessive emotions, as if trying to distance herself from any assumptions about her role in the events. Meanwhile, the press continued to actively discuss the version about an unknown maniac who allegedly committed the crime and tried to cover his tracks. The police officially did not refute this hypothesis. However, the main focus of the investigation remained on the kindergarten staff. The kindergarten collective found itself under the close attention of the police. The atmosphere inside the institution sharply deteriorated. People began to suspect each other and avoid communication. Investigators were certain of one thing. The key to solving the tragedy lay precisely here, within the walls of the kindergarten, and had no relation to maniacs or random passers-by. Jana Sukupova's personality, her actions, and the circumstances of Alisa's disappearance were now closely intertwined. And with each day of investigation, the police saw more clearly that there were practically no coincidences in this story. The investigation sharply turned inside the kindergarten itself. From the moment Jana Sukupova became the main object of police attention, the atmosphere among employees became noticeably tense. Outwardly, this looked like an ordinary investigation of tragic events, but police quickly noticed that this tension was not simple concern. It was hiding something greater. On the 23rd of April, the Ministry of Internal Affairs initiated a large-scale check of all documentation and financial activities of the Slunechko kindergarten. At first, such a decision seemed like a standard procedure. However, the collective's reaction turned out to be unexpectedly painful. Employees behaved in a closed manner, spoke monosyllabically, and avoided direct answers, as if they were afraid of an extra word or wrong look. This nervousness especially intensified after police were given an audio recording of a short phone call made in an anonymous collective chat of employees. A female voice on the recording said the phrase, "The main thing is we stick to one version. Nobody says anything extra." Investigators quickly established the identity of the speaker. It turned out to be the kindergarten director, Pavla Shizichkova, an experienced leader who had not previously come into the field of investigation. Police immediately called Shizichkova for a conversation, during which the director was forced to admit that it was indeed her voice. She confirmed that she demanded that kindergarten employees limit conversations with outsiders, and especially with the press. However, Pavla categorically denied that she meant any concealment or attempt to distort the facts of the investigation. According to her words, this was done only to avoid provoking panic among parents and the public. But another circumstance arose that confused the situation even more. Immediately after calling the director for interrogation, information appeared in the media that violations in financial documentation had allegedly been revealed at the kindergarten. The press wrote about possible theft of money during the purchase of products and materials for the institution and connected these events with Alisa's disappearance supposing that the kidnapping could have been a distracting maneuver to hide other machinations. Director Jiříčková completely rejected such accusations. Nevertheless, the Ministry of Internal Affairs quickly conducted a check of all purchases, payments, and contracts concluded by the kindergarten over the past year and a half. Experts carefully checked every signature, every acceptance act, and soon officially announced no financial violations had been discovered. The version circulated by the press completely lost relevance. Pavla Jiříčková was officially excluded from the list of suspects in the financial part, although her role in the general situation still remained not completely clarified. But the tension at the kindergarten did not decrease. The collective still maintained apparent calm, but inside a conflict was clearly brewing. Employees persistently avoided conversations about the incident, kept in groups, and constantly glanced at each other, as if trying to understand who would first violate the agreement about silence. Jana Sukupová seemed especially tense. Despite official police statements that the investigation was not completed and there were no final charges yet, she looked more tired and irritated daily. Her communication with colleagues almost completely ceased. Sukupová came exactly at the appointed time, quickly performed her duties and immediately left, avoiding conversations even with her closest colleagues. The investigators felt that the kindergarten staff was desperately trying to preserve the institution's reputation. It remained unclear whether this was caused only by professional ethics or whether the employees seriously feared something. The verification of personal files of all kindergarten employees did not yield clear results. However, the police noted that some employees had worked together for many years, and there existed an unspoken loyalty among them. Meanwhile, the traces discovered earlier in the kindergarten basement became even more significant. Criminalists clarified that the chlorine residues and cleaning traces were fresh, clearly made with the purpose of destroying evidence. When asked direct questions by police, the staff answered uniformly. Only several people had access to the basement, including the head teacher, educators, and the cleaner. Jiříčková herself confirmed that on the day of Alice's disappearance, she was not in the basement at all and did not know who exactly could have been there. Despite closing the version about financial violations, police continued active checks in other directions. The next step was the announced verification of external surveillance cameras on Dukelska Street, which could show previously unknown details of kindergarten staff movements, including Jana Sukupova's car. The search for a definitive answer was increasingly shifting in this direction. The investigators continued to act cautiously, understanding that any accusations must be supported by indisputable evidence. However, the nervousness of the staff and obvious desire to maintain a common line alarmed the investigation more and more, forcing them to assume that they knew or suspected something they were afraid to report to police. On the morning of the 25th of April, police obtained a new video recording from a surveillance camera of a private house located at the intersection of Dukelska and Studnicna streets. This camera had previously remained outside the investigation's field of view, as the house was temporarily uninhabited. The recording from the 12th of April was carefully studied, and within a few hours, police made a most important discovery. On the recording, captured at 22:34, a white Škoda Fabia automobile is clearly visible. License plate number 1, U15823. The car moves slowly along an unbeaten road toward the Bilina River. A license plate check immediately showed the owner. It turned out to be kindergarten teacher Teresa Gorakova. This discovery instantly made her one of the key figures in the investigation. Until this moment, Teresa had hardly attracted the investigation's attention, remaining in the shadow of her more emotional and nervous colleague, Jana Sukupová. Gorakova behaved coldly, distantly, and never showed obvious signs of worry, which previously allowed her to avoid active police attention. That same day, investigators summoned Teresa for urgent questioning. There was one question. Why did she go late in the evening toward the river along a route that practically no one used? The woman looked calm and confident, explaining her late departure with a simple domestic situation. Allegedly, she was forced to urgently take her sick cat to a veterinarian who had late appointments. The story seemed convincing, but investigators immediately decided to check it. A police patrol went to the veterinary clinic on the city's outskirts. The veterinarian confirmed that he indeed knew Teresa and her animal, however, immediately reported that he had no appointment that night. Moreover, the veterinary office closes daily at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening and does not accept even the most urgent patients at late hours. The version about the trip to the doctor for the cat completely collapsed within an hour. After this, police informed Teresa that her version was not confirmed. The woman, having heard this news, did not change her expression at all and immediately fell silent, using her right not to testify against herself. Her behavior aroused even greater suspicion among investigators. Teresa Gorokova's automobile was immediately seized for inspection. Police obtained a warrant to search the car and particularly thoroughly checked the trunk compartment and interior. Official results of the car examination were kept secret at that time. However, the very presence of Teresa at the Belina River at such a late hour became a powerful argument against her. Investigators returned to the chronology of events. The route from the kindergarten to the river was approximately 4 kilometers. The car journey took about 8 minutes. Teresa's departure time, 22:34, coincided with the presumed time of moving Alice's remains to the river according to expert conclusions. The new camera recording fit perfectly into existing evidence and strengthened suspicions. Teresa's colleagues reacted to this news with surprise and alarm. In the collective, it became obvious that trust in each other had sharply weakened. Within a few hours, among the staff appeared conversations that Teresa was clearly hiding something, and the version about the sick cat sounded absolutely ridiculous and implausible. The atmosphere became even more tense. No one wanted to be involved in what now looked not just like an incident, but a full-fledged crime. Police also decided to recheck routes along which other kindergarten staff cars could have moved that evening, but only Teresa Gorakova's Škoda was recorded specifically in the river area at that time. In fact, her car became the only direct evidence linking anyone from the staff to the place where Alice's remains were found. The press, again, actively joined in covering the investigation. Journalists quickly learned about the new turn and again began to assume that Teresa might have had a personal motive related to dislike or hidden conflict within the kindergarten. However, police refrained from official comments on this topic so as not to create false confidence in uncovering motives. Nevertheless, investigators had not yet received an answer to the main question. If Teresa's version about the veterinarian was a lie, then why exactly that evening and at that time did she need to be near the river? There was no answer to this question yet, but her very presence there gave the investigation confidence that the path to solving the case had become much shorter. At that time, investigators did not voice any direct accusations, but it was obvious that Teresa Gorakova was now under close attention from law enforcement agencies. Police decided to conduct another interrogation, while investigators continued to carefully check all evidence to get closer to solving the mystery of Alice's tragic disappearance. By the morning of the 27th of April, the investigation of Alice Novotna's case entered a decisive phase. Police concentrated all efforts on detailed study of Teresa Gorakova's automobile, which was seized and placed in a specialized police garage in Most. Criminalists' attention was immediately drawn to the strong smell of disinfectant coming from the trunk of her white Škoda Fabia. Experts promptly began checking the automobile using luminol, a substance capable of detecting blood traces even after thorough cleaning and treatment with chemical agents. Within minutes, the entire surface of the trunk compartment was covered with characteristic spots of bluish glow, unambiguously indicating the presence of blood previously removed using chlorine. Teresa Gorakova was again summoned for questioning, where investigators directly asked about why her automobile was so thoroughly cleaned and treated with chemicals. The woman continued to behave absolutely calmly, as if she had prepared for this question in advance. She stated that several days before Alice's disappearance, she was forced to take her old dog for euthanasia to a veterinary clinic. According to her words, the blood in the trunk could have belonged to the dog, which allegedly got injured at the last moment. Investigators recorded Teresa's testimony but did not make premature conclusions. They had already encountered fabricated stories from her more than once and understood that objective facts were needed. Blood samples were immediately sent for DNA examination, the results of which could completely change the course of the investigation. The waiting period for the examination was 48 hours. Meanwhile, investigators gained access to mobile correspondence between Jana Sukupova and Teresa Gorakova for the period close to Alice's disappearance. Among numerous messages was found one sent by Jana to Teresa on the evening of the 12th of April. "We managed. Everything clean?" Teresa's response was short and unambiguous. "Yes, everything is done." This message immediately aroused suspicions that both women acted in coordination and had previously discussed some details they wanted to hide from police. However, the investigation did not yet announce this information publicly, maintaining an advantage over the suspects. Teresa's version about the dog was also thoroughly checked. Police again contacted that same veterinary clinic where the euthanasia procedure allegedly took place. The veterinarian confirmed that Gorakova indeed had an old dog, but added that she had not appeared at the clinic for at least several months, and no procedures or operations were performed on the animal. Thus, this version also turned out to be fabricated and quickly closed. The kindergarten staff at this point had practically stopped communicating with both teachers. All employees avoided contact with Teresa and Jana, and the atmosphere inside the institution became so tense that some began voluntarily going on sick leave or even quitting to distance themselves from what was happening. 48 hours later, the examination results came in. The criminologist's conclusion was unambiguous and categorical. The blood found in the trunk of the Skoda Fabia belonged to a human. The genetic profile confirmed that the blood sample was female and belonged to a minor. The experts practically had no doubt that the blood could belong to Alice Novotna. However, an official conclusion about this was not yet announced to the press, so as not to provoke unnecessary panic and not to push the suspects to flee. Now the investigation had concrete evidence that directly linked Teresa Horakova to the tragic event. Although Teresa herself continued to deny involvement and insisted on innocence, her status changed to main suspect. At the same time, investigators still maintained caution in their statements, publicly avoiding final conclusions. The presence of SMS correspondence between Jana and Teresa further complicated the situation. It was obvious that both women acted together, but their common plan and motive remained closed to the general public and media. Nevertheless, it was clear to the police that the events of that day were premeditated in nature, and there was no accident in Alice's disappearance. The investigation began preparing materials for officially bringing charges and issuing arrest warrants for the suspects. But before the final decision of the matter, there remained details that needed to be brought together. The police carefully concealed the details of these actions, leaving not the slightest chance for the suspects to predict the investigation's next step. No one doubted that the finale of the investigation was near. However, only the investigators knew that behind Teresa's external calm and confident denial was something more, and it would soon give the final answer to the main question of this tragedy. By the beginning of May, the investigation possessed a sufficient basis to completely reconstruct the chain of events that occurred at the Slunechko kindergarten on April 12, 2022. Forensic experts and investigators conducted a comprehensive reconstruction. All found evidence was compared. Blood traces in the basement of the kindergarten, identical traces in the trunk of Teresa Horakova's car, camera recordings that captured her car near the Bilina River, the IP address of threatening emails through Proton Mail leading directly to the garden, and finally the phone call recorded in the staff's collective chat. It was this last fact that helped put the final period. The initiator of the call with the instruction to stick to the common version turned out to be teacher Jana Sukupova. Under the pressure of the collected evidence, the picture of what happened became completely clear. On that day, around 11 in the morning, Alice Novotna was playing on the kindergarten playground. By tragic coincidence, teacher Jana Sukupova carelessly turned, caught a metal bar which fell, hitting Alice in the head area. The fall proved fatal. Frightened of the consequences, Jana, without waiting for medical help, decided to hide what had happened. On the same day, around 10 o'clock in the evening, a telephone conversation took place between Jana and Teresa, which was recorded by one of the communication operators at the official request of the police. In the conversation, Jana's clear and unambiguous phrase was heard: "If this surfaces, they will imprison us." After this, both teachers decided to jointly dispose of the remains and evidence. Experts precisely reconstructed the subsequent actions. Alice's body, weighing about 14 kilograms, was placed in a black bag, carried out through the service exit where there were no surveillance cameras, and loaded into the trunk of the Skoda Fabia belonging to Teresa. The route to the Belina River, covering 4 kilometers and taking about 8 minutes of driving, completely matched the surveillance camera recordings. Additional confirmation came from physical evidence found in the basement. Alice's jacket with characteristic paint traces that completely matched the garden's fence. The basement, treated with chlorine, became the starting point of this entire chain. On May 3rd, 2022, police received an official arrest warrant for the teachers. First, Jana Sukupova was detained. At the sight of the police, she sharply changed color and tried to destroy her mobile phone by throwing it into a kettle with boiling water. However, operatives quickly extracted the device and preserved the correspondence as physical evidence. Teresa Horakova was detained at home several minutes after this. The woman behaved calmly, silently fulfilled the police requirements, and made no attempts at resistance. During the investigation, the women maintained silence, refused confessional testimony, and demanded lawyers. The case was transferred to court on September 14th, 2022. The prosecution qualified Jana Sukupova's actions as unintentional murder and attempted concealment of crime, and Teresa Horakova as an accomplice in concealment and aiding. The court proceedings continued until November the 22nd, 2022. Following the review of all collected materials, evidence, and witness testimony, the court rendered a final decision. Jana Sukupova was found guilty of unintentional murder and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Teresa Horakova, found guilty of complicity and concealment of crime, received 8 years of imprisonment. The court materials were partially classified, and the investigation did not provide answers to many questions. Only the fact that the version with a maniac and suspicions regarding Petr Kovarik were definitively refuted and documentarily closed was officially confirmed. The last session ended with heavy silence. Alice's parents, Tomasz and Katarzyna Nowotny, never received an answer to the only remaining question. They asked the accused, "Was Alice alive when the car left the kindergarten?" No answer followed. Materials concerning the exact time of Alice's death are still classified. Also classified is the internal investigation by the Czech Ministry of Education regarding the admission of garden staff to work with minors. The case of Alice Novotná remained in the history of the city of Most as one of the most high-profile and difficult tragedies of recent decades. The court decision became the last official point in this case, although many circumstances that could shed light on the motives of the teacher's actions remained a secret, closed under the seal of strict confidentiality. The tragedy ended with a sentence, leaving behind silence in which there was no place for words and explanations.